Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan, and welcome to the latest episode of our sports show. As you know, we've been previewing and preparing on air now for the last couple of weeks. In fact, last month or even more now, about our upcoming rugby documentary called My Life in Rugby, Global Rugby Legends, where we speak to renowned players from the Northern Hemisphere countries, Wales, Scotland, France, England, Ireland, and Italy, and around Southern Hemisphere countries, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and Argentina. We speak to a whole wealth of rugby renowned stars, joining their path throughout their rugby careers from childhood all the way up to their first international cap, and to the highs and lows of maybe winning a Rugby World Cup final or winning a Grand Slam, to the bitter lows of injuries, tasting defeat, and along the way as such. And we have Scottish representation now to follow on from the likes of Andy Nicol, to follow on from the likes of Craig Chalmers, Scott Hastings, Hugo Southwell, another Scottish contingent there this week speaking to us, the one and only Chris Cusiter. Chris, over his 10-year Scotland international career, made 70 appearances as scrum half, was scoring 15 points. He's also appeared for Glasgow Warriors 58 times with 15 points. He's also appeared for Perpignan, 39 appearances at 15 points, and he won the French title in 2009 with Perpignan as well. He is capped British and Irish line. He made his appearance in 2005 in the New Zealand tour against Argentina. First of all, Chris, I suppose one thing that struck me, and you might enlighten me about this, was actually you started off with Glasgow Warriors before you got your first break with the Borders. And now the Borders are no longer with us. You might enlighten our viewers and our listeners. What was the Borders made up of in terms of Scottish a rugby sort of club? Were there a formation of 5 or 6 clubs amalgamated together to become a professional club? And at that time, were they competing against the likes of the Leinsters, the Munsters, the Connachts, and the Ulsters in the Magners League?
Yeah, so they were. I mean, they weren't so much made up of all the clubs. All the amateur clubs are still there. The famous clubs from the Borders like Melrose, Gala, Hawick, they're still there, but the idea was to have a third professional team in Scotland at the time. So initially, I think they'd had 4 teams in '96, had gone down to 2, Edinburgh and Glasgow, and then they wanted to add in the third, which was the Borders. So it was based down in Galashiels, and yeah, I think back in the day it was the Celtic League, with obviously the Welsh teams and the Irish teams. So yeah, I think I joined in the second year that they'd been in existence, and then it went through until 2007, at which point it was kind of disbanded, mainly for financial reasons. So yeah, it was those were the early days for me, and actually for professional rugby in Scotland, it was still kind of the early days, and they were still trying to figure out the best structure for Scotland to progress as a professional country.
And were you able to garnish a big sort of audience for those home games? And was there real sort of interest there? Could you garnish the same audience which Edinburgh and Glasgow could garnish in terms of crowd? Or was it always the time to try and promote yourself? Were you, or did you have a low sort of fan base? Was it very hard to fill the gates in terms of the home games?
Yeah, it was. I mean, so we played at Netherdale in Gala, which is not a big ground, so you didn't need a huge amount of people to fill the ground. But this is going back to 2003-ish, or that's when I started. At least I think they started in 2002. But professional rugby in Scotland, at least, has come a long way, as it has in most places. But the crowds at Edinburgh and Glasgow were probably not what they are now back then. So I think pushing 1,000, would have been a kind of average gate for Edinburgh and Glasgow. So the Borders, we're trying to push for 1,000 and grow from there. But and there was the odd occasion where I think in the early days they got some big crowds, but in the Borders, the clubs are very they're very passionate about their own hometown. So Hawick, has a famous rugby team, produced a lot of great players. Stuart Hogg, obviously, being the most recent or the most obvious. And Gala, going back through its history, had some amazing players back in the day, but it seemed that it was difficult to try and bring all those supporters together to support a new professional team which had just been created. And actually, a lot of those supporters wanted to support their hometown team. And although there was the one-off, bigger crowd or for the larger occasions, it never really gathered momentum in the same way that maybe Glasgow has now done, only in the last few years, where they're getting sellout crowds every, of whatever it is, 5,000-6,000, and then taking games to Celtic Park and that kind of thing. This is a long time ago, and it was definitely changed days. So it probably never quite managed to get the support that they'd envisaged when they decided to put a professional team down there.
And Chris, lastly, be a question on the borders before I bring you back out to your childhood. In terms of the pool base, was it all local sort of lads, domestic sort of lads like yourselves, all Scottish players and domestic country? Were you able to get any big names, big overseas players from the Southern Hemisphere, any sort of French players, renowned internationals that, like all the time, maybe Glasgow and Edinburgh could get that international player to boost the profile, the resume? Were you able at the start to entice any players like that to come on board with the Borders?
Yeah, we had good players that, they recruited from all over, really. There's a lot of guys from the Southern Hemisphere came up. Paul Thompson, who'd been at Auckland Blues, Wayne McEntee from the Waikato Chiefs. We had a couple of Samoans that were phenomenal players. Semo Sititi was our number 8 and pretty much man of the match every time he played. Tanner Vili, who had Super Rugby experience, played for Samoa. And then there was a good smattering of kind of young Borders lads who were really, really talented, guys like Ross Ford, Nicky Walker. They'd also signed guys like Gary Armstrong, Donny Weir, George Graham, who were at Newcastle at the time. So, they put together a good squad, and they signed Tony Gilbert, who was an ex-All Blacks coach, to be the coach in the early days. But it's one thing having good players. It's another to try and build something from nothing, and to build a culture and a club from nothing does take time. And it probably didn't have the time. It wasn't allowed the time that it was needed. I think it was around for 5 years in the end. But when you're competing against the Irish provinces, for example, or some of those, the Welsh teams are probably more similar, but the Irish provinces who've been around for a long time with a huge history, you are up against it. And despite a lot of good players, the results never quite happened for the club. A few one-off victories, but never a consistent run of results. And that was probably part of the problem in the end, where they decided it wasn't, there wasn't enough money to go around to support 3 teams, so that the Borders was the one that got cut.
Chris, growing up, did you come from a family of 1 or 2 brothers or sisters? And the part of Scotland where you grew up in the 80s, early sort of 90s in your childhood career, was it a sort of rugby area, or was it a football area? Was you on the borders of the Hearts, Hibs, Motherwell sort of area in terms of where you were sort of based at that sort of time? And was it sort of, did you play a bit of both, rugby or football, or was it very much brought up in a rugby orientated area? And from a young age, were you involved in athletics, track and field, other sorts of sports? And did you come from a sporting household? Were your mother and father sporty? You had your sisters and brothers who were good athletes as well?
Okay, a few things.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Aberdeen, which is it's a football town. Aberdeen
Okay.
Football Club are
Rich
pretty
history,
well. Yeah, good history. And when I was growing up in the 80s, they were obviously had a great team, a lot of success. So I grew up, wanting to go and play football for Aberdeen. And then about, my dad had played rugby, my older brother played rugby. So when I was 10, went to the school up there, Robert Gordon's College, that played rugby. So I started playing rugby and really quickly got into it. Aberdeen's probably not really a hotbed of rugby in Scotland. There's a couple of good local teams, Gordonians, that my dad had played for, and Aberdeen Grammar were the 2, teams that were, at various stages of their, history were in the top tier. But really at that time, you kind of had to go to the central belt, Edinburgh, Glasgow, to further your career. So, when I left school, I was, very ambitious with rugby and I wanted to go further. So the obvious place to go was to the central belt. So I ended up going to university in Edinburgh and joining a couple of club teams down there over 3 years. And that's probably took me on to the next step. So it's kind of, it's a shame, because Aberdeen's it's a good area. It's a good sporting area. There's obviously a lot of kids there, and we don't have a huge population in Scotland. And I think they have since set up an academy up in Aberdeen, based out of the Sports Village. So they are looking at it and trying to harness some of that population up there. But it's it's still got a long way to go. There's no professional team there still, so there's no immediate path. I think for young players, you still probably have to consider moving down to the Central Belt, which or further afield, which is what I did. But no, I grew up in a rugby family. My dad was a big rugby player back in the day and a big rugby fan. So he heavily influenced my brother and I, and my brother is a couple years older and was a very good player. He played professionally for a year, played for Scotland Sevens. So he was always my kind of, I was always trying to emulate him or copy him or catch up to him. So once I switched schools, it was rugby all the way.
And I suppose, Chris, in terms of, you mentioned growing up in Aberdeen and you mentioned your sort of childhood there. In terms of growing up and pursuing rugby, were you always, when you started off, were you a small guy? Were you light? Were you fragile? Were you delicate? Maybe 11 or 12-year-old sort of boy? Were you always sort of propelled maybe into that back row in terms of a scrum half, in terms of a fly half, maybe a centre like that? Had you sort of nimble sort of feet, or was it opposite the case? Were you a big, strong, strapping 10 or 11-year-old sort of young lad that played around the forwards, and then later on in the years sort of got moved back to the back row, in terms of the backs, I mean?
No, I was never described as a strapping young lad in my whole life. I was always pretty small, quite quick. And, I like the physical side of it, but I think I played center maybe for 1 year when I was 10 and then quickly moved it into scrum half because I was probably the smallest guy. So I was there from pretty much the whole career. I think they knew I was going to be smaller, and it was probably the right decision. I don't think I would have or could have played anywhere else. So it was, that was my position from day one, and pretty much.
And amazing, I spoke to Andy Ellis, the New Zealand Rugby World Cup winner, and he obviously plays the scrum half position. He told me that he's sort of learning to, obviously throwing a scrum half, you have to be able to propel off the right hand and the left hand. And he actually found it, as time went by, he found it actually easier to throw off what he deemed to be his weaker side, even though he might write with the right hand. He taught me he found it easier to sort of pass off the left hand in terms of getting more length on it. And in terms of you growing up as a scrum half, was that the earlier challenge maybe in the first 2 or 3 years? Were you sort of always throwing off your favorite side in terms of those passes, or did you get sort of comfortable fairly quick of being able to stretch your distance, or was it a case as you got older, you got bolder and bolder in terms of being able to throw off both sides?
I don't know. Yeah, I was more comfortable with I'm right-handed, but I was more comfortable off my left, the same as Andy Ellis by the signs of things. I don't think I could really pass very well at all until, maybe 18 or 19 when I started to work a little bit harder on it. And to be honest, even by the end, it was never one of the great passers, compared to some of the guys out there. But, I kind of enough to get the job done and, try to balance it off with, other areas of strength. But it's, there's some, when I watch the guys now, there's some phenomenal passers out there with a great technical ability who probably learned the right technique early on, and I never really did. And didn't really have anyone to teach me properly, to be honest, when I look back. So you pick up bad habits and you're always trying to correct them. But, I got to an acceptable level, a level that allowed me to obviously play for Scotland, the British Lions. So I was by no means a poor passer, but there's always better passers out there.
And Chris, did you start to emulate your game in terms of the Scottish? Were you looking at the Brian Redpats in terms of trying to emulate their sort of what they did in terms of their sort of mimic their role in terms of scrum half? Or do you very much individualize this yourself just to be your own type of character on the sort of field? Did you never really try and model your game around anyone?
I mean, we did. I think when I was a teenager, you'd always look at who's playing for Scotland, and it was Gary Armstrong, Brian Redpath, Andy Nicol. Those were the three guys that were around most when I was a teenager. So of course, that was my dream, my ambition to play for Scotland. You'd watch them, I think laterally, when I was in university and looking at other players, George Gregan was the guy who was kind of the world leading scrum half at that point. So we used to watch a lot of videos of him and study his style of play and his technique and try to emulate some of that. And then as I got older, I would look at guys like Fru Dupree was always the guy I thought was phenomenal player. In terms of his all-rounded capabilities, like phenomenal kicker, great runner, unbelievable passer. He was the kind of boss of that team. So, I think as you develop, you look at other people, but I think every scrum half is a bit different. Everyone has natural strengths and weaknesses, and I think it's probably important to try and play to your own. You could look at someone, and it's maybe natural to look at somebody who has strengths that you don't have and try to emulate them, but we all have what we have. And I probably, in retrospect, looking back, I wish I'd stuck to my game a wee bit more rather than trying to become a passing scrum half or a kicking scrum half. It was never really my forte. So, you develop as you move on, I suppose, and as you mature and grow and your game changes throughout the years. But, I think looking back, I probably wish I'd stuck to my game a little bit more.
I suppose that dynamism and that partnership, obviously, it's the Batman Robin sort of partnership. The scrum half is always deemed the Robin, while the fly half is always deemed the Batman in terms of the glorious sort of highlights in terms of rugby players. So it's a sort of bonding for every team. You look at Wales when they were going strong, Howley and Jenkins. You look O'Gara, sort of stringer for Ireland. You look at Dawson, Wilkinson from England, as sort of such. So you obviously played with a good lot of teams like Glasgow. You played obviously the Borders as well. Did you always feel that there was a certain fly half that you had a real good connection with? And in terms of that fly half, then there was always an onus on in terms of decision making. Did he obviously trust you with your box kicking, or was the sense, right, I need to hit the ball out to him and he did most of the kicking, or was there a sort of universal understanding there?
Yeah, it would depend on who you're playing with, for sure. I think I played a lot of different fly halves over the years, really. Maybe too many to mention, but I played with Dan Parks quite a lot. He was a great kicker of the ball, great organizer, so that probably helped take the pressure off me in some ways, and I could maybe cover for him in other areas. I played a great year with Finn Russell at Glasgow when he was coming through, and saw his talent even at a young age. I really enjoyed playing with him. Guys like Dunky Weir, Phil Godman. You play with a bunch of guys over time, but a lot of it depends on what's going on in front of you. Obviously, as a scrum half, so it's easier for me or for the 10 if we're on the front foot, if we're getting good attack and ball, and I think the coaches have to probably dictate a game plan that suits the players they have. So I think when you had that combination of players, a game plan that suited them, and confidence and everything else that came with it, then you had a high performing team. So I think in my last year at Glasgow, that was one of the most enjoyable years I played, and that was with Finn Russell mainly at standoff, but a really great team all round, really good pack, very well coached side by Gregor Townsend, a lot of front football, and that was probably the most enjoyable year I had. But you need a lot of factors to come together to create that kind of feeling. And the following year they went on to win the league for the first time, so it was it was the basis of a very, very good team, and as a result, very enjoyable.
Chris, one thing that always struck me when the border sort of collapsed, obviously you had to find yourself a new club, a new sort of professional contract. Obviously there was interest in a good lot of the border players, and obviously I imagine people will look at it and say, oh well, he's just going to move down to the Premiership, the English sort of Premiership, maybe go to Sale, maybe go to Bath, maybe go to Wasp, London Irish or something. Maybe he might even venture a bit further, go to Wales team. But you took a daring sort of boldness in terms of going to the top 14, the French sort of rugby, Perpignan, sort of such. Was that at the time? Was there offers in England? Was there offers in Wales, Ireland, maybe? And what maybe did you want to test yourself really further out? Did you want to see, right, can I really crack this sort of the French rugby sort of league, the real sort of going up against Toulouse, Toulon, Biarritz, all these sort of sides? Was that the real compelling sort of passion maybe to explore what possibly might be once in a lifetime opportunity?
Yeah, I always had a thing for France, to be honest, and I loved playing down there whenever I was at the Borders. So when the borders was shut down, I did have a couple options down south with Premiership clubs. I think Gloucester and Saracens were, it was on the table, but at that point it wasn't that appealing to me. And I had, Nathan Hines, who second row was down at Perpignan at the time, and they were looking for scrum half. So I went down and had a look around, and I think I arrived maybe just before or around the Six Nations, and it was sunshine. It was great home stadium, and it just looked like an adventure to me. It looked like a totally different proposition to what I'd been dealing with, and I really wanted to do it. So I probably didn't think too much beyond that. I knew Perpignan were a good team at the time. So a chance to play in the French top 4 team is appealing. To live down in the south of France, very appealing. And so I didn't think too hard about it. I took that contract and stayed there for a couple of years. And yeah, it was a bit of a roller coaster, but overall, I look back, it was a really enjoyable 2 years. I learned a lot. I learned, how to play in a different culture, different environment, met a lot of good people, learned to speak French. So it was definitely a positive move, and very different style of rugby, probably very intense physically in terms of the forward battle, but some of the running rugby and the French style of play which came into it was it was very enjoyable playing on a dry pitch, and also playing in some of the famous stadiums around France. That was a real thrill, to be honest. So it was, no regrets about that. It was a lot of fun.
And the sort of French derbies, the sort of atmosphere, obviously Perpignan, Bordeaux, obviously Toulouse, those sort of big, sort of heavyweight sort of counters. In terms of the French fans and the French base, and in terms of those passionate following, was that something like you'd see basically in an Italian soccer game between, say, a Roma and a Lazio? In terms of the fan base, was it really diehard? Was there walking out to those stadiums in Derby Day, in terms of maybe were coming down to closing stretch, maybe when league titles were to be decided? Was it almost like walking into a cauldron? Was it almost different to anything you experienced while you were playing in your time in Scotland?
Yeah, very different. I mean, very well supported teams, and those local derbies, or if one of the Parisian teams came down to Perpignan, like the atmosphere was amazing. You'd have anywhere between, I don't know, 13, 14,000 really passionate home fans, a small amount of away fans, and brass bands, and really loud, intense. And it was a huge element of you playing at home, and if you won, it was great. When you're away from home, it made it very difficult. And obviously there's not a huge amount of away wins in the French league, or there wasn't back then, but it was very different. Very intense games, and a lot of bus trips. It was just, the whole experience was very different. But I think I still miss it. I think it's a great place to play if you're a young player. You learn, the scrum halves in France have probably a different level of responsibility to what they do in the UK. The 9 is more like probably the 10 in the UK. A lot of the 9s are goal kickers, which I wasn't, but the 9s, I had to call the lineouts, which I'd never done before. But in that particular team, the coach wanted the 9s to call the lineouts. The 9s call the back moves a lot of the time. So a lot more responsibility, I would say. And they put a lot more onus on the 9 to kind of organize everything, really. So that was new and challenging for sure. But it's good to be challenged, and good to learn, outside of your comfort zone.
I suppose, Chris, you made your debut for Scotland in 2004, and I suppose starting off 2004 with Scotland, it was probably the Scotland had come off maybe the Gregor Townsend, sort of Kenny Logan, sort of were probably at the elder sort of statesmen, probably towards the latter end of their sort of careers, maybe had, in terms of you Dan Parks, you were the new young guns coming onto the fray at that stage. It was almost like a top passing of the guard, maybe, of a real wealth of experienced players departed the Scottish scene around that sort of time. Were those Six Nation years? I know you got injured in 2005 and 2006, but from the 2004 to 2008, were they really tough? Some really tough times for Scotland, and in terms of Six Nations, obviously Italy turned you over once and twice in those sort of years as well. Was it hard those times really to look to see maybe England, maybe and almost like being driving in a Formula One car, and you chasing them in a sort of minority as sort of such?
I mean, it's definitely true that they were tough years. I think 2006 was actually a good year. I think we won 3 games. I think France, England, and Italy. So that was probably the highlight of those of that period. But yeah, a lot of experienced guys left. A new coach came in. It wasn't particularly successful. A lot of younger guys were coming through and getting experience. But yeah, we just didn't have a combination of factors to be able to consistently compete. And that's changed a lot, I think, in the last few years. A lot of guys who have come through the system a little bit later and physically and skill wise are right up there, and the coaching setup's definitely improved. So Scotland in the last 5 years have probably been the best they've been in the professional era. So it's been good to see. And there's a lot of guys that I play with that are part of that. So I'm really happy for them that they're getting those consistent victories. They still haven't been able to, win a Six Nations title or, put a longer run together in the World Cup. So there's still some way to go, when you compare it to Ireland or something like that, who are absolutely flying. But it's definitely progress over that time. Certainly from when I was involved, when we never really, as I say, I think it was 2006 was a decent year, but 1, maybe 2 wins in the Six Nations if you're lucky, maybe none. So it was definitely not a particularly glorious period for Scottish rugby, I would say.
And Chris, during your tussles with Ireland, the most prominent scrum half you would have come up against, obviously, would have been Peter Stringer. Most times you would have come up with Peter. I don't know, would you have come up against Conor Murray, maybe apart from later on, maybe once or twice against Munster, but maybe predominantly it was Peter that you came up against during your times against Scotland. And Peter was almost like... I'm not going to put him in the Van der Westhuizen category, but he was almost like that bit of sniper in terms of around the scrum. He almost like the bit of go as well in terms of the blind alley, in terms of where you always have to be on guard watching Peter, because normally with scrum halves, we think with old Gara outside him that he was passing, get the ball to Gara, but Peter liked to go and break an awful lot of times off the back of the scrums as well. So he was a wary sort of customer. I imagine you would try and constantly keep an eye on him to watch those sort of breaks, because he did like that sort of Van der Westhuizen sort of break down the touchline as well off the back of the scrum.
Yeah, I mean, he scored that famous try in the European Cup final against Biarritz, which was phenomenal for Munster. So yeah, I think he would be surprising, because he was probably known as more of a passing scrum half, and a phenomenally consistent, long, accurate pass. But yeah, he held his own. He's obviously a smaller guy and physically, but he probably passed 99 times, and then on the 100th one, if you took your eye off him, he could break. Yeah, and really a phenomenal competitor, I think. Very, very professional. We ended up playing together at Sale Sharks in my last year of professional rugby, so that was really fun, actually, to get to know him a little bit and practice together. And yeah, nothing but respect really for the way he looked after himself and the way he approached rugby. He was kind of the ultimate professional, and I think he kept going until he was like 39 or something, which is really beyond me. I just turned 40, so I can't even imagine have been playing professional rugby a year ago. So yeah, I think I probably played Conor Murray maybe once or twice, definitely in the club game. I'm not sure about international, to be honest. But yeah, Peter Stringer was probably the main guy for a lot of the time that I was playing.
Yeah, and Chris, obviously you got to travel with the British and Irish Lions. You got captain the Lions in 2005, that tour of New Zealand. First of all, to make the cut in terms of the Lions, it's obviously an extended squad. So to make that sort of trip, obviously, it's no mean feat in terms of obviously it's scrum halves from Wales, England, Ireland, and sort of Scotland as well. There's a raft of sort of scrum halves. So when you made that sort of trip in terms of the scrum halves you were competing against, did you feel maybe that you were maybe further up against the ranks? And that 2005 tour, the British Irish Lions tour, who were the sort of scrum halves that were standing in your way? Was it Dawson? Was Dawson the main one that was standing in your way in terms of breaking into that starting team come test time?
Well, Dwayne Peel really was the starter on that tour. I think he started all 3 tests, and he was, he'd had a phenomenal year with Wales, and he was super sharp. So I don't think anybody was really contesting that. And then there was myself, Matt Dawson, and Gareth Cooper, who had, played a lot for Wales and was a phenomenally talented player, like physically unbelievable, so quick and strong, great passer. And then Matt Dawson, who'd won the World Cup with England. So it was a lot of competition. I suppose, I played a lot in the midweek team, and I thought I maybe had a shot of getting on the bench for a couple of the tests, which didn't happen. I think Matt sat on the bench, and it's fine. It would have been great. And but I think just going on that tour and that whole experience of touring with the Lions was phenomenal in itself. And I probably didn't ever think that would be something that would happen growing up in Aberdeen. So I just loved every minute of it. It was a tough tour for the test team, midweek team. We had a lot of fun. We won a lot of games against obviously easier opposition, but no, I got to play with some great players, meet a lot of good guys, and I have no regrets really. I would, if that was offered to me, and it's, you get to go on tour, you don't get to play the test, then obviously I would take that every day of the week. But yeah, that was a good time. It's a long time ago now, but it was a good time.
I suppose, Chris, an awful lot of rugby players experience career-ending injuries, sort of prolonged injuries. I know Craig Connell had to retire. The Welsh sort of prop had to retire from rugby. He was told that another sort of injury or any connection around his neck, he will find himself in a wheelchair for the rest of his days. But you had sort of, I wouldn't say career-ending injuries, but persistent sort of knee injuries throughout your career, which sort of dogged your career. You could never really sort of shake those off, and there were sort of recurring knee injuries. How does it affect you now that you are retired? Are those sort of a distant memory, or do you still sort of feel knee pain, joint pain, discomfort around your knees? Is there cartilage issues or ligament issues around your knees, or is there any mobility issues affecting your walking? Could you go out now and play a 7-a-side soccer match tomorrow morning and run around with the lads or friends of your own age, or has it had a long-lasting lingering effect even now after you've retired?
Yeah, I've definitely got some lingering issues from rugby for sure. My knee, yeah, I fractured my kneecap. I can't remember what year, but that kept me out for about a year, and that was probably the worst thing I had in terms of my lower limbs. So I still feel that. I have a bit of tendonitis, I think, in my patella tendon, but it's manageable. I'm still very active. I work out a lot and no problem. My shoulders, I dislocated my left shoulder twice, had surgery to reattach my pectoral here. So like my shoulders are kind of a little bit weaker, but they don't, on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't really affect me. My back hurts a little bit from various issues, but I think if you play professional rugby or even rugby for long enough, and all the impacts you take and the inevitable injuries, then you're going to have something. But that's the way it goes. I wouldn't change anything. It's unfortunate. I wish I hadn't missed so much rugby with those injuries. I think with my shoulder, my knee alone, I missed maybe 2.5 years of rugby out of 13, which is a lot. So I regret that, and maybe with the benefit of hindsight, would try to maybe adapt the way I played a little bit for a bit more longevity. But it's a physical game. I was always really committed physically, and my body just wasn't always able to stand up to that. But it seemed like that was par for the course. You get surgery, you get rehab, and you get back out there. And yeah, I have no regrets. It was I had a great career, a good time, and it's easy. You probably couldn't have the highs without the lows. So I'll take those if that was the price to pay.
And Chris, obviously, you're well-established businessman out now in the Los Angeles, move to the United States at the moment. And I know United States is a rugby country. I know Scott Murray is from Scotland's out there doing a bit of work at the moment in terms of US rugby and involved in that. And obviously, you have a young family. Would you ever see into the future now in terms of your own sort of children later on in the years, maybe getting involved if you were to stay out longer, if you in the USA, in trying to get involved in underage routes in terms of US rugby or development teams up along, is in terms of bringing the next generation of US rugby and sort of stuff? Would that be an interest of you? Would you have any interest in maybe hooking up with Scott or building a connection there and the Scottish sort of tandem that you would have had from your playing days, or are you very much parked now your rugby career and looking on to the next part of your life is a more of a fan-based approach you are now watching on from the United States?
Yeah, I like to watch the big games of rugby now as a fan. I'll tune in for the Six Nations mainly, and obviously I'll watch the World Cup. I don't really have an inclination to go and coach or really be involved that heavily. Other than that, I love to watch the game, but it's a very intense career, and it's very, very focused and all consuming for a long time. So I think when it ended, I was happy to move away from it and try and discover something new. And it is a bit of a bubble. As soon as you leave that bubble of rugby or professional rugby, there's a lot more out there to discover. And that was for me, one of the main drivers in coming over to California and getting into the world of whiskey and something completely different. So that's my career now. I really enjoy it. I've met a lot of good people and made a lot of progress here. So I think I'm happy with that. But I'll always be a big Scotland fan. Always watch the Six Nations and try and get to games whenever I can. I'll be back next year, hopefully for the Scotland Ireland game at Murrayfield. So there's always there's a connection there that's never going to go away. But no, in terms of coaching, it's not really for me. I'm happy to be up in the stands watching these days.
Okay. And Chris Cussiter, finally, if I said to you, looking back at the Chris Cussiter in 2005, just made the British and Irish Lions team, obviously well established now in his sort of club career. What did he sort of bring to a rugby team every time he donned, whether it was a Scottish jersey, a Perpignan jersey, a Glasgow Warrior? What did his teammates get out of him in terms of when he stepped onto the pitch? And what did he bring to a team? Was it composure? Was it leadership skills? Was it a sense of calm and reliability? Or was he just a real sort of humble sort of guy, a good teammate that you could have that sort of bit of crack around and enjoy the festivities once the seriousness was sort of done in terms of that? Or was he very much a driven sort of focused individual that was the sort of the driving force in the dressing room behind the teams he was involved in?
I tried to play with 100% commitment. Really, every time I took the pitch, it was all in, and physically, emotionally, I tried to put it all into that. And hopefully my teammates would have seen that, though you would have had to ask them. But I enjoyed the team aspect of it. I love being part of a good team, and I tried to always do my part to help that team be successful. That was and I miss that now that I'm out of a team environment. That's probably the one thing I miss the most is it's kind of putting it all out there with your teammates and having a beer after and catching up. So it's you'd have to ask them if it's any different. But no, I think that a lot of guys say that physicality and the commitment that you have to your team is hard to replicate that once you leave that environment. And I definitely would agree with that. I feel that quite strongly. But I think that those bonds that you have with ex-teammates that you played with over the years never really go away. I think you can always come back to that, and there's a mutual respect, which I'll, I think we'll all remember forever. So, yeah.
Okay, on that note, Chris Cusiter played over 70 times for Scotland between 2004 2014, scoring 15 points. A British and Irish line 2005, capped against Argentina, won a French title with Perpignan in 2009, played 58 times for Glasgow Warriors, 39 times for Perpignan, scoring 15 points as well. Made his debut for Scotland in 2004 Six Nations versus Wales. Numerous highlights. Joint captain with Mike Blair and the Autumn Internationals for Scotland as well. So obviously a stellar sort of career, Chris. You can look back with fond memories. That's your life story in rugby. Thanks for joining us today, and we wish you all the best. And a blossoming whiskey business, no doubt, and judging by the photos you have there, still going very strong. Chris Custer, stay safe, God bless, and enjoy sunny California.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jim. Cheers.
Thank you.